Prepare for a Civil War story that will shatter every assumption about enemies and compassion, when a hardened Confederate colonel witnesses an act of selfless love that transcends the battle lines. His world and heart are forever changed. This powerful tale explores how mercy can bloom in the darkest hours and proves that humanity's greatest strength lies in caring for those who cannot care for themselves. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell for more historical stories that show love conquering even the deepest divisions of war. The Mercy of Enemies, Chapter 1. The Sight That Changed Everything. Colonel James Beauregard rode through the aftermath of the Battle of Shiloh with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too much death and too little victory. His grey uniform stained with mud and blood that belonged to soldiers whose names he would never know. The April rain had turned the Tennessee battlefield into a hellscape of churned earth and scattered bodies, where the hopes of Confederate independence lay broken beside the corpses of boys who had marched away from home, believing their cause was blessed by divine providence. 2 days of fighting had accomplished nothing except to fill the hospitals with screaming wounded and the graveyards with silent dead. The Confederate retreat from Pittsburgh Landing had been conducted in good order, but it represented another missed opportunity to break Union resolve through decisive battlefield victory. At 34, Beauregard had already fought in enough engagements to understand that the war was becoming a contest of endurance rather than military brilliance, and the South's resources for such a contest were disturbingly limited. His current mission was grimly practical, surveying the battlefield to identify wounded Confederates who might be saved and Confederate dead who deserved proper burial. The Union forces had withdrawn to lick their own wounds, leaving a temporary truce that allowed both sides to tend their casualties without fear of renewed fighting. It was humanitarian work, but it also provided opportunities to assess enemy losses and gather intelligence about Union capabilities and morale. The farmhouse appeared through the morning mist like something from a more peaceful world, its whitewashed walls and neat garden standing in stark contrast to the devastation that surrounded it. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting habitation despite the battle that had raged across these fields for 2 days. More significantly, Beauregard could see figures moving around the property, civilians who had somehow survived the fighting and might possess information about Union casualties and movements. As he approached the farmhouse, the scene that greeted him defied every assumption he had developed about the nature of this war and the people who were caught in its path. A woman sat on the front porch, perhaps 25 years old, with the kind of pale, worn beauty that spoke of hardship, endured with quiet dignity. Her simple dress marked her as belonging to the farming class rather than the plantation society that had shaped Beauregard's upbringing. But it was what she was doing that stopped him cold with shock and growing recognition. She was nursing an infant, holding the child to her breast with the gentle attention that motherhood required, but the blue cloth wrapped around the baby marked it unmistakably as belonging to a Union family, probably the child of one of the Northern soldiers who had fallen during the recent fighting. This Southern woman was providing the most intimate care possible to the offspring of her supposed enemies, treating a Union baby as if it were her own child. Beauregard dismounted and approached the porch with the careful movements of someone uncertain about what response his Confederate uniform might provoke. The woman looked up at his approach, her dark eyes showing wariness but no fear as she assessed this unexpected visitor. There was something in her expression that suggested she had already seen enough suffering to be moved more by compassion than by political considerations. "Ma'am," Beauregard said quietly, removing his hat in automatic courtesy. "I'm Colonel Beauregard of the 15th Alabama Infantry. I hope I'm not disturbing you during this difficult time. Not disturbing me any more than everything else that's happened in the past 2 days," the woman replied, her voice carrying the gentle drawl of rural Tennessee, mixed with an underlying strength that suggested she was accustomed to facing difficulties alone. "I'm Sarah Mitchell. This is my farm, or what's left of it." Beauregard's eyes took in the evidence of recent battle damage. Bullet holes in the farmhouse walls, broken fences, trampled garden plots that had probably represented this woman's primary source of food for the coming year. But his attention kept returning to the infant she was nursing, whose presence raised questions about compassion and loyalty that challenged everything he thought he understood about the conflict dividing the nation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Beauregard said carefully, "might I ask? That is, I couldn't help but notice." "You want to know why I'm nursing a Union baby," Sarah finished for him, her voice carrying matter-of-fact acceptance of the question she had probably been expecting. "His mother died during the fighting, caught a stray bullet while trying to flee with the other camp followers when the battle started. She asked me to care for him before she passed." The simple explanation hit Beauregard with unexpected force. Here was a Southern woman who had lost everything to Union military action, yet she was providing life-sustaining care to the child of her enemies. The moral complexity of the situation challenged every assumption about loyalty and hatred that had sustained him through 2 years of increasingly bitter warfare. "That's remarkably generous of you," Beauregard managed, though the words felt inadequate to the magnitude of what he was witnessing. "Generous?" Sarah's slight smile carried sad irony. "Colonel, this baby didn't choose his parents' politics any more than the boys lying dead in my fields chose the circumstances that brought them here. He's hungry, I have milk since my own baby died of fever last winter, and letting an infant starve because his father wore the wrong uniform seems like the kind of sin that would follow me to Judgment Day." The matter-of-fact way she spoke about personal tragedy while performing this act of mercy created a tightness in Beauregard's chest that had nothing to do with his battlefield injuries and everything to do with a growing recognition that the war had not destroyed all human decency. In a world where neighbors had become enemies and brothers had taken up arms against each other, this woman had chosen to see an infant's need rather than a political symbol. "Mrs. Mitchell," Beauregard said slowly, "you mentioned that your own child." He paused, uncertain how to ask about personal losses that were clearly still raw wounds. "Little Thomas died in January, born healthy, but the fever took him when he was just 3 months old." Sarah's voice carried the controlled grief of someone who had learned to function despite devastating loss. "My husband died at Stones River fighting for your cause, Colonel. I buried my baby in February, and now I'm nursing the child of the men who killed my husband. If that's not proof that this war has turned the world upside down, I don't know what would be." The revelation that Sarah's husband had died fighting for the Confederacy, while she now cared for a Union child, created moral complexities that made Beauregard's head spin. This woman had every reason to hate Union forces, every justification for viewing their casualties with satisfaction rather than compassion. Instead, she was providing the most fundamental care possible to an enemy child whose very existence represented everything that had destroyed her personal happiness. You could have. There are orphanages, military authorities, who would take responsibility for Union casualties, Beauregard offered hesitantly. Could have, yes, but by the time any such arrangements could be made, this little one would be dead from starvation. Besides, Sarah paused, adjusting the infant's position with practiced ease. Caring for him helps ease the ache where my own Thomas used to be. Strange how grief sometimes leads us toward kindness instead of bitterness. Beauregard found himself studying Sarah's face as she spoke, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her despite the obvious hardships she had endured. There was something beautiful about her compassion, something that spoke to ideals he had nearly forgotten existed after 2 years of witnessing humanity's capacity for destruction. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and Beauregard turned to see a Union patrol cresting the hill that overlooked Sarah's farm. 8 blue-uniformed cavalry were riding directly toward the farmhouse, their presence suggesting either coincidence or intelligence about Confederate activity in the area. Either way, their arrival created immediate complications for everyone involved. "Mrs. Mitchell," Beauregard said urgently, "those are Union soldiers. My presence here could create difficulties for you. Perhaps I should." "Perhaps you should sit down and have some coffee," Sarah interrupted calmly. "You're wounded. I can see blood on your uniform, and you need medical attention more than you need to worry about political complications." Before Beauregard could protest, the Union patrol had reached the farmhouse yard and was dismounting with the cautious efficiency of soldiers operating in potentially hostile territory. Their leader, a captain whose uniform bore signs of recent fighting, approached the porch with his hand resting casually on his pistol grip. "Ma'am," the Union captain said, touching his hat in polite greeting, "I'm Captain William Hayes, 2nd Illinois Cavalry. We're searching for Confederate wounded who might require medical attention or transport to our field hospitals." Sarah's response was a model of calm neutrality. "Captain Hayes, I'm Sarah Mitchell. This is Colonel Beauregard of the Confederate forces. He's wounded and was seeking assistance when you arrived." The Union captain's eyes moved to Beauregard, taking in the Confederate uniform and assessing potential threats. But his expression also registered the strange domestic scene. A Southern woman nursing an infant while providing assistance to an enemy officer who clearly posed no immediate danger. "Colonel," Hayes said carefully, "under normal circumstances, I'd be obligated to take you prisoner. However, these don't appear to be normal circumstances." Subscribe for the next chapter of this Civil War story about mercy transcending battle lines. Will the Union captain honor the unspoken truce created by Sarah's compassion? Click the notification bell so you never miss our powerful historical tales that show humanity's capacity for grace even in the darkest times. Chapter 2. The Truce of Compassion. Captain Hayes studied the scene before him with the careful assessment of an experienced officer trying to reconcile military duty with human decency. A Confederate colonel sat wounded on a Southern woman's porch while she nursed what appeared to be a Union infant, circumstances that defied standard military protocols and demanded judgments based on character rather than regulation. "Mrs. Mitchell," Hayes said finally, "might I ask about the child you're caring for? The circumstances seem unusual." Sarah's explanation of the Union mother's death and her decision to care for the orphaned infant clearly affected the Union captain in ways he hadn't expected. Beauregard watched Hayes's face cycle through surprise, recognition, and something that looked very much like profound respect as he absorbed the moral complexity of what this Southern woman was doing. "You're caring for Lieutenant Morrison's son," Hayes said quietly, his voice carrying new understanding. "We've been searching for the boy since the battle ended. Morrison's wife. We found her body yesterday and assumed the child had been killed as well." "He's safe and healthy," Sarah assured the captain, adjusting the infant's position with gentle competence, "though he'll need more care than I can provide long-term. I have milk enough to keep him fed, but he'll eventually need family or proper placement with people who can raise him appropriately." Hayes studied the child with the careful attention of someone making important decisions about human welfare. Morrison was a good officer and a decent man. His wife was traveling with the regiment because they had no family back home to care for the boy. The captain paused, clearly weighing competing obligations. "Mrs. Mitchell, the United States Army would be deeply grateful for your kindness to this child, but we also understand the difficult position your generosity has created. Beauregard found himself admiring the Union captain's thoughtfulness, recognizing a fellow officer who understood that some situations required human judgment rather than strict adherence to military protocol. The infant Sarah was nursing represented a bridge between enemies, creating obligations that transcended the political divisions that had brought their armies into collision. "Captain Hayes," Beauregard said carefully, "I appreciate your consideration of Mrs. Mitchell's situation. She's shown extraordinary mercy to all parties involved, and I hope that will be recognized regardless of other circumstances." Hayes nodded, his attention shifting between Beauregard's obvious wounds and the domestic scene that had transformed a potential military encounter into something far more complex. "Colonel, you're clearly in need of medical attention. Under different circumstances, I'd be obligated to offer you transport to our field hospital, but I suspect you'd prefer to arrange your own medical care." "No, that's very generous of you, Captain," Beauregard replied, grateful for Hayes's tactful recognition of the delicate situation they all faced. "However," Hayes continued, "there are practical matters we need to discuss regarding the child's future. Young Morrison needs more care than Mrs. Mitchell can provide indefinitely, and the Army has obligations to ensure proper arrangements for the orphans of our fallen soldiers." Sarah spoke before either officer could continue the discussion. "Gentlemen, perhaps we should focus on immediate needs before worrying about long-term arrangements. Colonel Beauregard needs his wounds properly cleaned and bandaged. The baby needs feeding and care. And you, Captain Hayes, look like you could use food and rest." The practical suggestion created a moment of domestic normalcy that temporarily superseded military considerations. Sarah rose carefully, still holding the infant, and gestured toward the farmhouse interior. "I have coffee, bread, and what medical supplies survived the battle. Perhaps we could set aside rank and politics long enough to address human needs." What followed was one of the strangest interludes of Beauregard's military career, sitting in a Tennessee farmhouse kitchen while a Union captain helped bandage his wounds and a Southern widow prepared food for Confederate and Federal officers alike. The infant slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, oblivious to the political complexities his presence had created and the way his small existence was reshaping the understanding between supposed enemies. "Mrs. Mitchell," Hayes said as Sarah served coffee and bread that represented significant sacrifice given her current circumstances, "the Army would compensate you for your care of Lieutenant Morrison's son. Your kindness shouldn't be a financial burden on top of everything else you've endured." "I don't want compensation, Captain. I want to know that this child will have a good home with people who love him, despite the circumstances of how he came to need care." Sarah's voice carried the authority of someone whose moral certainty transcended political considerations. "Money can't replace the family he's lost, but proper placement could give him the chance for happiness that every child deserves." Beauregard found himself studying Sarah's profile as she spoke, noting the intelligence and compassion that seemed to guide her every action. There was something remarkable about her ability to see human needs rather than political symbols, to respond to suffering with mercy rather than the bitterness that would have been entirely understandable given her personal losses. "There's another consideration," Beauregard said slowly, voicing concerns that had been growing throughout their conversation. "Mrs. Mitchell's care for a Union child could create difficulties for her with Confederate authorities or sympathizers who might view such actions as collaboration with the enemy." Hayes nodded grimly. "And her assistance to Confederate wounded could create similar problems with Union forces who don't understand the circumstances." The captain paused, studying Sarah's composed expression. "Ma'am, you've placed yourself in a position where both sides might question your loyalty, all for the sake of caring for people who needed help. My loyalty is to Christian charity and human decency, Sarah replied simply. If that creates political problems, then the politics are wrong, not my actions. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of more approaching horses, and through the window they could see another Confederate patrol riding toward the farmhouse. Beauregard recognized Major Thompson from his own regiment, accompanied by 6 soldiers who were clearly searching for their missing colonel. "That's my unit," Beauregard said, rising carefully despite his bandaged wounds. "Captain Hayes, I suggest you and your men." "No," Sarah interrupted firmly. "Everyone stays exactly where they are. I've had enough of armies trampling through my property and threatening people who are doing nothing but trying to survive this madness." Before either officer could protest, Sarah stepped onto the front porch with the Union infant still in her arms, presenting herself as the farmhouse's undisputed authority. When Major Thompson approached, she greeted him with the same calm directness she had shown to both Beauregard and Hayes. "Major, I'm Sarah Mitchell, and this is my farm. Your colonel is inside receiving medical attention for wounds sustained in the recent fighting. There are also Union soldiers present under informal truce while we sort out care for this orphaned child." Thompson's bewildered expression as he tried to process the situation was almost comical. "Ma'am, did you say there are Union soldiers?" "I said there are wounded men, orphaned children, and people trying to help each other survive the aftermath of a battle that accomplished nothing except creating more widows and orphans." Sarah's voice carried an authority that made the major step back despite his superior rank. "If you wish to resume fighting, you can do it somewhere else. This farm is now neutral ground dedicated to Christian charity." The declaration was so unexpected and delivered with such conviction that Thompson apparently couldn't formulate an immediate response. Beauregard used the moment of confusion to emerge from the farmhouse, his visible wounds and Captain Hayes's respectful bearing helping to explain the unusual circumstances. "Major Thompson," Beauregard said carefully, "Mrs. Mitchell has provided medical assistance and humanitarian aid that transcends military considerations. I believe we owe her respect and protection rather than complications." For the next hour, the most unlikely gathering of Beauregard's military experience played out in Sarah's farmhouse, Confederate and Union officers sharing coffee while discussing the practical arrangements needed to care for an orphaned infant and ensure the safety of a woman whose mercy had created obligations for everyone involved. Don't miss the next chapter. How will this unlikely alliance protect Sarah and the baby she's saved? What happens when higher command learns of this extraordinary truce? Subscribe now and hit the bell icon for more Civil War stories that prove compassion can triumph over the deepest divisions. Chapter 3. The Colonel's Redemption. The solution to their impossible situation came from an unexpected source. Major Thompson's revelation that his own sister lived in Nashville and had been trying unsuccessfully to conceive children throughout 5 years of marriage. The connection created possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine when the conversation began, transforming a complex problem of military protocol into a potential blessing for everyone involved. "Mary and her husband have been praying for a child for years," Thompson explained as the unlikely group gathered around Sarah's kitchen table. "They have the means to provide excellent care and the desperate desire for a family that would make this infant the answer to their deepest hopes." Captain Hayes leaned forward with obvious interest. "Your sister would be willing to adopt Lieutenant Morrison's son? To raise a Union orphan as her own child despite the political complications?" "Mary's heart is bigger than politics," Thompson replied firmly. "She and her husband understand suffering, and they would see this child as a gift rather than a burden, regardless of his parents' allegiances." Sarah studied the Major's face with the careful attention of someone whose decision would shape an infant's entire future. "Major Thompson, I need to understand your family's character before I'd consider transferring this child's care. He's been through enough trauma without being placed with people who might resent his origins or treat him as anything less than a beloved son. Thompson's detailed description of his sister's character and circumstances gradually convinced everyone present that the arrangement could indeed provide the orphaned infant with the loving home he needed. Mary Thompson Coleman was the wife of a prosperous Nashville merchant who had remained neutral during the war's political upheavals, focusing on business and community service rather than military involvement. More importantly, she was known throughout Nashville for her charitable work with children and her genuine desire for a family of her own. The practical arrangements would require some coordination, Beauregard observed, his strategic mind working through the logistics of transferring a Union orphan to Confederate civilian custody. We'd need safe passage for Mrs. Mitchell and the child, assurance that the adoption would be legally recognized, and guarantees that the boy's origins wouldn't create future difficulties for the Coleman family. Captain Hayes nodded thoughtfully. The United States Army would formally transfer custody to appropriate civilian authorities, with documentation that would protect everyone involved. Lieutenant Morrison's family history shows no Confederate sympathies, so political considerations shouldn't affect legal recognition of the adoption. As they worked through the practical details, Beauregard found himself watching Sarah with growing admiration for her wisdom in handling an impossibly complex situation. She asked intelligent questions about the Coleman family's character, insisted on guarantees that the child would be told truthful stories about his origins when he was old enough to understand, and demonstrated the kind of maternal protectiveness that suggested she had genuinely bonded with the infant, despite caring for him for only 2 days. "There's one more consideration," Sarah said finally, her voice carrying careful reluctance. "This arrangement would require me to travel to Nashville, which means leaving my farm unprotected during a period when military activity continues in this area." The observation created a moment of silence as everyone recognized another layer of sacrifice that Sarah's generosity was requiring. Her farm represented her only means of economic survival, yet ensuring the infant's proper placement would force her to abandon it to whatever fate might befall undefended property during wartime. "Mrs. Mitchell," Beauregard said slowly, an idea forming that surprised him with its clarity and rightness. "What if I provided escort for your journey to Nashville and remained to assist with protecting your property while you're away?" The offer emerged from some part of his character that the war had not yet managed to destroy, a recognition that Sarah's extraordinary mercy created obligations for anyone who witnessed it. But even as he spoke, Beauregard realized his proposal carried implications that went far beyond simple military courtesy. Captain Hayes studied Beauregard's face with obvious curiosity about motivations that clearly extended beyond standard officer conduct. "Colonel, that's a generous offer, but wouldn't it create complications with your own military obligations?" "I have accumulated leave time, and my wounds provide medical justification for temporary relief from active duty," Beauregard replied, though he was still processing his own motivations for making such an offer. More importantly, Mrs. Mitchell's situation represents exactly the kind of civilian need that military service is supposed to protect. Sarah's expression showed surprise and something that might have been gratitude, but also wariness about accepting assistance that could create new complications. "Colonel Beauregard, that's very kind, but I couldn't ask you to compromise your own situation for my convenience." "You're not asking, I'm offering," Beauregard said firmly, surprised by his own certainty about a decision that seemed to make itself. "Mrs. Mitchell, what you've done here, caring for this child, providing aid to wounded enemies, creating space for human decency in the midst of all this madness, It represents everything I thought we were fighting to preserve. Protecting you seems like the least I can do to honor those ideals." The conversation continued for another hour as they refined plans that would ensure the infant's safe delivery to his new family while protecting Sarah from the various dangers that could threaten a woman traveling alone during wartime. Captain Hayes agreed to provide documentation that would allow safe passage through Union-controlled territory, while Major Thompson offered Confederate protection for the portions of their journey that crossed areas under Southern military authority. As evening approached and it came time for the Union and Confederate patrols to depart, Beauregard found himself reluctant to leave Sarah alone on her devastated farm. The past day had awakened feelings and perspectives that challenged everything he thought he understood about duty, loyalty, and the values worth fighting for. "Mrs. Mitchell," Beauregard said, as he prepared to rejoin his unit, "I'll return in 3 days with arrangements for our journey to Nashville. If you have any concerns or difficulties in the meantime, I'll manage." Sarah replied with the quiet confidence he was learning to recognize as characteristic. "But Colonel Beauregard, thank you, not just for the practical assistance, but for understanding why this matters. Too many people have forgotten that we're all supposed to be human beings first, regardless of the uniforms we wear or the causes we serve." As Beauregard rode away from Sarah's farm, he carried with him the image of a Southern woman nursing a Union infant, a vision that would reshape his understanding of what honor actually meant and what purposes military service should ultimately serve. The war would continue, battles would still need to be fought, but he had seen proof that mercy could survive even the deepest divisions, and that some obligations transcended political loyalties. 3 days later, as he returned to escort Sarah and the infant to Nashville, Beauregard realized that his heart had indeed broken open, not with despair, but with a recognition of possibilities he had never allowed himself to imagine. The woman who had shown such extraordinary compassion to an enemy's child had awakened something in him that felt very much like hope, and perhaps something even more profound that he was only beginning to understand. Subscribe for more Civil War stories about redemption and love blooming from the ashes of conflict. Will Beauregard find his own path to healing through protecting the woman who showed him what true mercy looks like? Hit the notification bell for historical romances that prove the human heart's capacity for transformation even in war's darkest moments.